What counts as retro is something that is often hotly debated, and not only will it vary from person to person, but it will change over the years. There was a time when people would sneer at the idea of the original Halo being considered a retro game, but the stone-cold fact is that it's more than 20 years old now, so I think it does count as retro at this point. Still, by and large when people think of retro gaming, they tend to think of the 80s and 90s, when video games first began to grow in popularity, and many titles from that era are still remembered quite fondly. But while I was born in the 90s, I have no clear memories of anything before the turn of the millennium, and it wasn't until the mid-2000s that I really got into video games. And coming from my admittedly very biased perspective, personally I think it wasn't until the turn of the millennium that video games as a medium really became consistently good. That's not to say that the games that came before were all bad, but the medium was still new, and between the limits of technology and the limited experience of the people making games, most retro games are rather mixed bags. A good example of what I mean is to contrast the Super Nintendo library with the Game Boy Advance library. Both were systems with similar capabilities, but overall the Game Boy Advance classics have stood the test of time extremely well, while the Super Nintendo classics were usually held back by some of the archaic baggage that persisted from the NES era. And there are only two Super Nintendo games that I would say are truly timeless, namely Super Metroid and Chrono Trigger, as even great games like Super Mario World did have a few archaic quirks like a live system. Another example of what I mean is to compare Half-Life 1 and Half-Life 2. While Half-Life 1 was a good game, and it is still fun, it was constrained by the limits of its time. It was still pretty early in the era of 3D gaming, and between the limits of technology and the fact that games of this type were fairly new, it does show its age. But when you play Half-Life 1 and Half-Life 2 back to back, it becomes pretty obvious what a huge leap forward Half-Life 2 was in terms of gameplay, graphics, technology, and design, and by extension how gaming was finally maturing as a medium. Still, I wanted to look over the games from before the turn of the millennium that I do actually like, and compile a list of my top 10 favorites, because that's super original, right? At the very least, it would make all the time I've spent going through all these games seem worth it. For you impatient types who just want the list with absolutely no context, well, here you go. Enjoy. But if you want to know why I picked these 10 games, then click on the link in the description to read the full article, because I was feeling lazy and really didn't want to have to edit an entire video.